Yeah.
My Lords, in this group, in relation to communications offences, I particularly do want to speak in support of Lord Moylan's Amendment 265 and then his stand part of Clause 160, and speak against and raise concerns, or rather raise concerns about Amendments 267AA and AB in the name of the noble Baroness Lady Helena Kennedy. Having heard her explanation, maybe she can come back and give me some clarifications that I raise. In terms of Clause 160 and the false communications offence, unlike Lord Moylan, I do want to focus in on psychological harm and the challenge that this poses for freedom of expression. I know that we've debated it before, but I think in the context of the criminal law, it matters in a different way, and I think it's worth us at least dwelling on some aspects of it. The false communications offence refers to what's described as causing non-trivial psychological or physical harm to a likely audience. And I note that, as I understand it, and maybe I want some clarity here, it's not necessary for the person sending the message to have intended to cause harm, yet there's a maximum sentence of 51 weeks in prison or a fine or both. And yet I think we need to have the context of a huge cultural shift when we consider the nature of harm we're talking about, because J.S. Mill's harm principle has now been expanded, as previously discussed, to include traumatic harm caused by words. And speakers are regularly no-platformed for ideas that we're told cause psychological harm, both at universities, but more broadly it's part of the whole cancel culture discussion. And over the last decade, harm and safety no longer just refer to physical safety, but have been conflated. And so, whereas historically we understood the distinction between physical threats and violence as distinct from speech, however aggressive that speech was or however incendiary, we didn't say that a speech was the same or interchangeable with bullets or knives or violence. And now we do. So I want us to at least pause. What counts as psychological harm is just not a settled question. And so the worry is that we have an inability to ascertain objectively what psychological harm has occurred, and I think this will inevitably lead to endless controversies of interpretation and or subjective claims making, some of least could well be in bad faith. There's no median with respect to how humans view or experience controversial content. There's a wildly divergent sensibilities about what is psychologically harmful. So social media lawyer Graham Smith, I thought, made a really good point when he said that speech is not a physical risk, it's not a tripping hazard or a projecting nail that will foreseeably cause injury. He says speech is nuanced, subjectively perceived and capable of being reacted to in as many ways as there are people. And I think that that's true. And we've seen an example of the potential disputes over what creates psychological harm with a case in the public realm over the past week. The former Culture Secretary, Nadine Dorries, who indeed oversaw much of this bill in the other place, had her bullying claims against the SNP's John Nicholson MP overturned by the Standards Watchdog. Her complaints had previously been upheld by the Standards Commissioner. John Nicholson, the MP, tweeted, liked and retweeted offensive and disparaging material about Ms Dorries 168 times over 24 hours, which is, as they say, a bit OTT. He liked tweets describing Ms Dorries as grotesque, an vacuous goon, and much worse. It was very unpleasant, no doubt, for Ms Dorries. Certainly a personalised pile-on, the kind of thing that Baroness Kennedy has just talked about. And, Ms Dorries would say, psychologically harmful. But her complaint was overturned by new evidence that led to the bullying claim being turned down. And what was the new evidence? The new evidence was that Ms Dorries herself was a frequent and aggressive tweeter. So here we have a situation in which somebody is a recipient of something which says causes them psychological harm, and it's just been said, well, it doesn't matter because you're the kind of person who causes other people psychological harm. And my concern about turning this into a criminal offence is that the courts are going to be full of those kind of arguments, which I think we wouldn't want. And one problem I have is that the bill doesn't give any explicit protection in terms of a public interest or for the purposes of debate use of such harm, even if it's, as has been indicated, even if it's making false allegations. Because the point is, if you consider what political arguments are like, people use hyperbole, exaggeration, and many of the big political questions of the day are not agreed on. And people accuse each other of lying all the time when it comes to anything from Brexit to gender. So I'm worried that inadvertently, and I don't think anyone's trying to do this, that Clause 160 will institutionalise the core and bake into a primary legislation the core of cancel culture and actually lead to a more toxic climate than any of us would want. Just in terms of some of the reservations I have about the amendments 267 AB, which of course I recognised and full of admiration for the intention of the noble lady Baroness Kennedy and what she's trying to do. But on the wording, it seems to be making an offence to issue communications, it says, concerning death, rape, assault, sexual or otherwise, or disfigurement, knowing it will cause alarm or distress. And I wanted to query how we would prove that someone knows that it will cause offence, something that was kind of slightly glanced at. But also, if you consider things like news websites, podcasts, all sorts of communications, a lot of that content could actually be said to purposefully cause alarm and offence and distress, maybe because you want to shock people into the realisation of what a war or a famine is like, or to shock people into understanding the dangers of groomers or the dangers of suicide sites, the kind of things that we've been discussing here. And, you know, the nudge unit during the lockdown actually explicitly issued communications that caused a great deal of alarm and distress about potential death, and they had a public interest defence, which was to say it was important that people were frightened into complying with the rules of lockdown, whatever one thinks of that. So I don't see how that won't be caught up in this. 267AB, no, AA, I've done it the wrong way around, extends the offence to include encouraging someone else to commit harm. And I do again understand that this is an attempt at dealing with kind of indirect, misogynistic abuse that's not quite incitement, but that on the other hand seems to be encouraging encouraging B, an indirect kind of threat that goes on. I always worry, of course, that this will lead to, you know, that if A did encourage another person and that the other person did something as a consequence of that, that this will lead to a he told me to do it defence and an abdication of responsibility. So there's that qualms that I've got with it. But I thought the member's explanatory statement made it even more difficult, because it said if an individual sends a message which, quote, potentially encourages other individuals to carry out a harmful act, I thought that this was just going to be wide open to an abuse by all sorts of bad faith complainants. I say all this in the context of being somebody who is regularly piled on. I noticed when I was starting to speak that Baroness Stewart was in, and I remember one of the shock and horror when I saw the kind of abuse that she got some, I think, 7 years ago and subsequently. I mean, really vicious, vile, horrible abuse for a political stance that she had, often taking a very sexualised form if you're a woman. And so I speak, as it were, using my lived experience to say that I know what it feels like to be on the receiving end of vile, horrible, misogynistic pylons. So does Joanna Cherry, so does Rosie Millard, so do a lot of people involved in contentious political issues. It's just that I think that what we need to do is to have politics made more civil by actually having the arguments and the debates out and not mischaracterising people or delegitimising them or demonising them. And I'm just not sure that a criminal intervention here is going to help. I think it might make matters worse.
My Lords,